the analytics group at Evolve. He applies state-of-the-art statistical methodologies and econometric techniques to glean new and unexpected insights from large volumes of client and public data. Prior to joining the Evolve team, he was the managing director of applied science at Pascal Metrics, where he led the firm's research and development initiatives and managed all data-related activities. He's also held positions at the RAND Corporation, the Urban Institute, and the Lewin Group. We hope you'll enjoy the insight our speaker is going to share with you during this program. With introductions complete, I'm pleased to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Dr. Michael Hausman.
Thank you, Mike. So for our agenda for today's session, we've broken it down into 4 sections. In the first section, we want to talk a little bit broadly about big data. Everyone's hearing about it in the news, and so we want to answer the question, what is big data? What does it mean? In the second section, we want to talk a little bit more about the application of big data, specifically towards workforce optimization. And we're going to answer the question, what can big data do for you? What are the gains that you can expect as a result of big data initiatives? In this third section, we're going to talk about a 5-step big data strategy. So instead of starting at a very high level, we want to really do this from the ground up. And we want to understand what are the steps that all of you can implement in the near term in order to use big data to drive workforce optimization and profitability. And then finally, we're going to draw on an example. And in this case, it's a Fortune 100 company that we've engaged with that used big data in order to improve attrition. And we're going to try to understand what they did well, where there's room for improvement, and how all of you can apply the lessons that they learned in order to do the same thing. So just to start, let's ask a very simple question. What is big data? It's been talked about in the news a lot, and the way we like to define big data is in terms of 3 things: volume, variety, and velocity. So volume, first, just the fact that there are larger and larger data sets being measured in petabytes and zettabytes that are now being made available to the enterprise. It means that a different class of tools and techniques have to be used in order to analyze this data. In terms of variety, we're finding that many of these data sets are coming from different locations than in the past. And so as a result, now we need to design the sort of mapping and merging capabilities in order to combine the different data streams in order to generate insight from them. And finally, velocity. Data is being generated at an unprecedented rate. Now it's not just daily or hourly or by the minute, but by the seconds. And so we're getting larger amounts of data more quickly from different sources, and we need to come up with a strategy for handling this data. The big data revolution has really changed a number of different industries. So everyone's familiar with the Moneyball example and the way that big data has revolutionized the way that baseball teams evaluate talent. We've seen a similar revolution in financial services. Now large credit card companies are using big data in order to assign credit risks and scores, as well as to identify fraudulent transactions. In healthcare, we're seeing data being used on an increasing basis in order to promote evidence-based decision-making within medicine. And now we're starting to see that movement towards the workforce, and data is being used by enterprises in order to make data-driven and evidence-based decisions around the workforce. So it's a very exciting time. And likewise, the media has really picked up on this. And so there's a lot of attention that's been devoted to big data as applied to the workforce. Articles that have appeared in The Economist, in The Atlantic Monthly, New York Times, Wall Street Journal that are documenting the ways in which data are really changing how the enterprise makes decisions around its workforce. And so this is an exciting time for the workforce and using data in order to promote these outcomes. So that leads to an obvious question, which is why now? Why is this shift occurring now? And it's really 2 things that are driving this. First is the shift to a service economy. And so what we've presented in the bottom are the largest American companies in 1960 and the largest American companies in 2010. And what you can see is that those orange dots, those represent manufacturing and goods producing companies. So in 1960, the biggest companies were companies that were producing goods. They were creating cars and electronics and refrigerators. And that's changed in just the last 50 years, so that now the largest companies are really driven by service companies. So companies that are in hospitality, fast casual dining, retail, those are really changing the way we think about our workforce. And the reason being that brand perception and recognition is being driven increasingly by the workforce. Those frontline employees are your brand. And so people are realizing that it's more and more important to ensure that those people are representing the brand well. Now, the second reason that we're seeing this shift, and this touches a little on something I mentioned earlier, is that the volume of data is growing exponentially. So there was a recent report that predicted that the amount of data that's available is going to grow 44 times over the next 10 years to 35 zettabytes. And for those who don't know, zettabyte is a 1 with 21 zeros behind it. So again, the massive amount of data that's being produced presents huge opportunities for us to mine and generate insight from this data in order to optimize the workforce. And we've included this quote on the left-hand side as somewhat of a facetious statement, because the idea is there's more data being made available. People are talking about big data, but it's hard to understand what to do with it and what it can be used to in order to optimize workforce profitability and help the organization. And so that's why we want to lead into the next section, and we want to ask the question, what can big data do for you, and how can you use big data in order to drive positive outcomes? And before we do, I'm actually going to throw it to Mike, because we want to ask a poll question. And the poll question is just to level set and get a sense of where everyone's coming from. So in a second, I'll hand it over, but we want to have everyone answer the question, do you currently have, or are you planning a big data initiative for your workforce in 2014? And I'll let Mike run the poll.
Very good. And you can see there are 2 bullets there for you to check, yes or no. And we want to reassure you that the votes are completely anonymous. You can vote without worrying that your results will be seen. And they're coming in. We're going to give our audience members just a moment more here to vote. And then we'll report the numbers out. And we do appreciate you voting. I am going to go ahead and push the results now. I know since we have number-oriented people, you will want to know how many people are responding to the poll. Right now, the results are just over 300 people, and it is a pretty pronounced split. We have about 70% who indicate they are not planning such an initiative, 30% who say they are. Dr. Hausman?
Okay, great. Thanks very much. That makes sense, and it squares away with our understanding. And what's I think is encouraging is that everyone who's on this webinar is kind of already thinking about this and thinking along these lines. And I'm hoping that what people can get are some action steps that they can take in the near future in order to start moving down this path. So in terms of why even use big data, there's actually a recent study that came out of Bain. And what they did is they divided companies up into 5 quintiles based on their analytic capabilities. And then they looked at the outcomes that were being driven by those organizations. And what they found when they compared those with the strongest analytic capabilities to those with the ones that were weakest is that those with the strongest analytic capabilities were 5 times more likely to make decisions quickly as opposed to their competitors. They were more agile. They were able to change course very quickly. They were also 2 times more likely to use that data and information when making those decisions. And so they were taking all different information into account. They were 3 times more likely to execute on the decisions as they had planned. And what's really key is that they were 2 times more likely to have top quartile financial performance. So the takeaway here is that the data allows these companies not only to make decisions and make the right decisions and make them more quickly, but ultimately it lends positive top-line financial performance to those companies. So it can be a huge competitive differentiator within the market. Well, in terms of workforce analytics specifically, there's a big spectrum there. And so there are two axes that we like to think about when we're looking at what applications and tools are available to all of you. The first axis is how generic and or workforce specific it is. So on the left-hand side, we see generic BI tools, even Excel reports. And when we start to get more workforce specific, we start to think about human capital management and employee scorecards. The other axis we like to think about is the extent to which these applications are backwards or forwards looking. So on the historical side, on the bottom half, we see all of those tools that tend to allow you to look backwards and at least diagnose after the fact what happened. But where we think that real sweet spot is the green dot in the upper right-hand quadrant. Those are predictive analytics workforce applications. So those are applications designed specifically towards the workforce and human capital data. But what's really key is that they allow you to make decisions in a forward-looking way. So rather than making a change of course and then waiting a few months and seeing what happens, it allows you to look ahead and figure out what would happen if I modified X, Y, and Z. How is that going to impact my attrition rates? How will that impact workforce performance? And allows us to decide on a course of action before we decide to execute on it. So make no mistake, big data is hard. These are difficult initiatives to engage in. And CFO Magazine recently profiled the 5 most common obstacles to engaging in a big data initiative. And we hear these all the time. So going from the top to the bottom, the first is just maturity, that we haven't matured enough to be doing predictive analytics. The second is we don't have enough data. Our data banks aren't large enough for us to really be thinking about doing any sort of big data initiatives. The third is we need to invest more in big data technologies like Hadoop and MapReduce in order to engage in predictive analytics. The fourth is traditional business intelligence tools, dashboards. Those are sufficient to get us where we need to go. And fifth is we need to hire a group of statisticians or economists before we can start to think about doing predictive modeling. And so what we wanted to understand for those, especially those 70% that had just said that this is something that they're not really thinking about in the coming year, is we want to understand what is the biggest obstacle. And again, these are all realistic and reasonable. So what is, I'm going to open up the poll in a second and hand it off to Mike, but what is your biggest obstacle in using your data to engage in predictive analytics? And all of those 5 options that I just listed are available as responses.
And so again, we would like you to take a moment here and think about the choices being presented to you in terms of what you think the biggest obstacle is. We understand more than one may apply, but of all the ones that apply, what would you identify as the main one? Your organization hasn't matured enough, you don't capture enough data, you still need to make investment in data technology, you believe that HR business intelligence solutions will suit your needs, or you just don't have the right people to look at the numbers and you need to hire some statisticians. So take a look at those, think about it. We see the results coming in from the audience, and again, we appreciate it. Again, want to reassure you the responses are completely anonymous, so no one will know what you say. And we'll give it just a second more here. See if we can get back toward this 300 threshold that we crossed the other time. Past that. So with about 325 having voted, actually now closing in on 350, we see the single largest response is we don't capture enough data. About 36% say that. Another 27% say they still need to make big investments. 20% say their organization hasn't matured enough. 9% believe HR business intelligence solutions are the way to go, and 8% say they still need to hire some statisticians. I've also gotten a couple of questions here through the Q&A indicating that there are some folks who might have selected other or none had those choices been there. Dr. Hassan?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And again, this actually does square away with our experience. We do believe that the key is, especially if the viewpoint is we don't have enough data, we actually think that starting small and kind of doing this in small chunks is a way to get to a big, robust data and analytics capability. But I'm going to talk a little more towards that in the next section when I outline that 5-step big data strategy. What I want to do now is just talk about what big data can do for you. And so this is a sample of outcomes that we've seen from just a smattering of our clients. In one case, a client that had interview times that were in excess of an hour, they were able to use big data in order to drive that down to just 15 minutes. We've seen one client drive a 39% reduction in attrition, which is huge when you consider the cost per turn can often range from $2,000 to $5,000. Those are really big dollars that can hit the P&L. We've seen clients of ours that are very concerned with brand experience and recognition drive a 3.7 improvement in Net Promoter Score and nearly 5% higher customer satisfaction. That's enormous in terms of retaining existing customers, but also generating positive word of mouth, getting more people on board with their services. We've seen a client automate a lot of their interview process, and as a result, they found they were able to achieve hiring quotas with 40% fewer interviews. So again, that means less of a burden on the recruiting and hiring manager staff, and they're able to focus more on training and developing the people and the raw talent that they brought in. We've seen a client of ours reduce attrition by 820 avoided hires in a year, and that amounted to a savings of $2.5 million. And ultimately, a client that was very focused on sales productivity and sales conversion, by hiring the right person that was a good fit for this role, a frontline sales role, they were able to achieve an 8 to 10% improvement in sales productivity. So again, all examples of how utilizing the big data can really achieve gains that you're going to see in the bottom line. It's really worth it. And on top of which, beyond just the sort of hard dollars and cents, we found that big data can really help align organizations. So at the end of the day, these data tend to be contained in silos. And often there's financial data maintained by the CFO, there's human resource data, and there's also operations data on the right-hand side. Those data exist within these different silos, but what we found is that big data initiatives can tend to be somewhat cross-cutting, that they cross disciplines and departments, and by implementing these initiatives, they allow everyone to work together and set aside the different turf in order to ensure that everyone's working together in lockstep towards a common goal. So we think this organizational alignment and this culture improvement is actually a really nice byproduct of big data initiatives. And finally, there was a recent Forrester report that made some predictions about 2014, all things related to data. And one of the really interesting insights that they came up with was that it's not just calling it big data, that you can't just lock an analyst in a room with a spreadsheet and say this is a big data initiative. That big data really needs to be aligned with fundamental organizational, cultural, and governance changes that are occurring within all levels of the organization. And so it needs to be much more all-encompassing than simply doing a very quick and dirty analysis. We need to make sure that stakeholders are bought into the way in which we arrived at these results, that they understand how we plan to execute and the goals. And we're going to talk about that in a second when we outline this 5-step big data strategy. So as I mentioned, the way we engage with all of our clients and the way we recommend that they go about doing this on their own is by following a very simple strategy, this 5-step big data strategy. And I'm going to outline the steps first at a very high level, and then I'm going to dig into each one individually. So first, it begins with the data. We need to unify and refresh the data, combine different data streams, and ultimately use those as a starting point. From there, we want to discover. We're going to be identifying which outcomes are most interesting and are most critical to our P&L. And then we're going to determine which are the workforce factors and predictors that are driving those outcomes. Second, we want to target improvement. So we want to identify what are our goals? How much is improvement worth in attrition and or performance? Given that, how much do we realistically think that we can achieve? And when we multiply those together, we get the potential ROI from this initiative. And we also need to talk about how much we're willing to spend. We're going to simulate, so we're going to engage in what-if analysis and understand what are the different outcomes that are yielded by different courses of action. So then we can compare between them the costs and the benefits and decide on the best course of action. We're going to deploy and act. So once we've chosen a single plan of action, we're going to put it into practice. We're going to determine action steps in order to get there, and we're ultimately going to execute on our plan. And then finally, we're going to track and measure. So this is all facilitated by closing the loop. We need to make sure that we're monitoring the outcomes on a continual basis or as close to real time as possible so that we can continue to improve and recalibrate and ensure that we're hitting our goals. So let me start first with that middle piece that I mentioned, which is unifying and refreshing the data. And what we like to say is that it really all starts and ends with the data. The quality of the analysis, the actions, and the initiatives that you take, they're really predicated upon the quality of the data that you're working with. So as a first step, what you want to do is take a step back and take stock of what you have in your possession. We find that most companies have HR data that's fairly robust, so those are the hire and term dates, reason for termination, location, the nature of the job. Typically, organizations have that within their possession. We find performance data is also housed within these organizations. We ideally want the data to be as granular as possible. If it's possible, daily performance metrics. In the absence of that, weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever's available, we want to be able to use that in order to drive improvement to KPIs. We want to supplement those data sources with supplemental data on various other employee attributes. Who's their supervisor? What shift are they working? What wages are they being paid? What's their rate of overtime? We also want to combine that ideally with macroeconomic data that's publicly available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau. We know all of those elements can also have an impact on workforce profitability. So once we've taken stock of those data sets, we're then going to dig in a little bit, and we want to understand consistency, accuracy, and data integrity. How good is this data? Again, we don't need it to necessarily be gold, but we want to ensure that we believe in the accuracy of the data in order to believe in the accuracy of the results and the insights. So we want to take stock of which data sets are most valuable and are most accurate. Those are obviously the highest priority when we're doing these analyses. Third, we need to think about combining these data streams. How do we combine them? Are there mappings that we can use? Can we create common IDs? How are we going to merge them up into a single complete workforce data set? Fourth is when we execute on those plans, we combine those different data sets according to the mapping that we already talked about. And then fifth is final data sanity checks. We're going to take a step back and we're going to say, how many employees do we have in the organization? How many are reported on in the data? You want to make sure those numbers are fairly similar. If there are any issues, now's the time to identify them. So now that we have a single unified data feed, we want to move on and we want to discover. And really what that means is two things. First, we want to determine what are the outcomes of interest. Do we care about attrition or do we care about performance? If we do care about performance, which element of performance is most critical? Is it customer satisfaction, average transaction time, sales conversion, schedule adherence? Which are the KPIs that are really driving outcomes to the P&L? Now, once we've identified the outcome of interest, we then want to think about what the predictors are. So what are the elements of the employee, the company, the location that are predicting improvement in the KPIs or attrition? Is it wages? Are those impacting attrition and performance? Is it the shift? Which locations are we seeing the best outcomes in? How are the supervisors impacting frontline performance? How are overtime policies having an impact on tenure? These are all the things that we're actually going to do in this case study I'm about to outline, but the goal is to say, where are the low-hanging fruit? Where do we want to be digging in first? Because we ultimately want to be looking at where we can get the biggest bang for our buck, the biggest impact. So now that we've discovered where the biggest impact can be made, we want to target improvement. And this is where we do a little bit of organizational soul searching. So we need to ask the question first, what is improvement worth? If attrition is our concern, what is the cost per turn? How much does it cost to recruit, source, train, and bring someone into the organization? If we're really interested in performance, for example, customer satisfaction, what's the value of a % improvement in customer satisfaction? We need to understand what's the ROI of these gains. And in order to do that, we need to figure out the value of improvements. Second, we're going to ask the question, how much do we want? Now, of course, in an ideal world, no one ever leaves the company and everyone provides perfect customer satisfaction and handles transactions in seconds. But ultimately, we need to recognize that there are trade-offs that need to be made. There are scarce resources. And so we want to be realistic about what sort of targets we're going to set for these KPIs. So how much do we realistically think we can get out of this workforce initiative? When you multiply those two together, what you end up with is a potential ROI. What's the return on investment? But the other side of that equation is how much are we willing to spend? So again, we live in a resource-constrained world. We need to ensure that we're able to devote certain resources to these initiatives. How much are we willing to devote in order to gain the improvement that we had just talked about? And then we're going to simulate. And really what that means is we've already identified how much improvement we want to achieve. We need to figure out how we're going to get there. And the best way to do that is to engage in what-if analysis. And this is where the predictive analytics are so key, because they allow us to take a course of action and say, okay, what happens if we change wage rates? Or what happens if we modify overtime policies? We need to recognize this is the workforce. So unfortunately, we don't have much of an opportunity to do trial and error. We can't just raise the wages and see what happens. We don't want to increase overtime and see how that impacts attrition. But the nice thing is that we're able to do that in a black box and identify what the outcomes are from each of these different paths. And then we're able to choose which is the path that is going to lead us to the optimal outcome that we desire. And so all of this allows us to experiment in this black box rather than doing this experimentation with your workforce. We also want to deploy and act. So this is the part where we've decided on a course of action based on our simulations. We know that course of action is going to lead us to the desired outcomes. Now we need to execute. So we're going to use the facts in order to develop a plan. We need to gain buy-in at all levels of the organization, from the top down and the bottom up. And this is really key. We need to socialize all of our analyses, our plan of action with everyone on the team. And we need to achieve two things in this initiative. We need transparency and accountability. Transparency in that we need everyone to see what's going on, how we landed at the course of action that we've decided on. And then accountability, we need to hold people accountable for certain gains. If the goal is to achieve a $2 million improvement in attrition, then we need to make sure that we're making steps towards achieving those goals. And that really speaks to this last piece, which is we need a process for tracking and measuring improvement. And that process needs to occur, again, from the bottom up and the top down. So the improvement is really facilitated at the local level, making sure that the employees are being impacted by supervisors, hiring managers, whoever is interacting with them. But we also need a higher level way of tracking progress against the goals. So this is really all about closing the loop and making sure that we're achieving the goals that we had stated at the outset of the study. And so ultimately what this allows us to do is recalibrate. if we find that one course of action isn't working as well as we'd hoped, we get that continuous feedback by running these analyses regularly, ideally weekly, maybe monthly, but we're getting these results and we know if we're tracking to our goal and we're able to make quick decisions around changing the course of action. So what I want to do, I've been talking at a very high level about this 5-step strategy. What I want to do is talk about a very specific case study featuring a Fortune 100 company that we've engaged with and how they use this process in order to achieve some pretty impressive gains in their workforce attrition in this case. And so again, we're going to work through each step of that 5 big step strategy, and I'm going to explain how they really did this work and how they engaged with their data and ultimately with their workforce. So let's start first with the problem. This is a large telecommunications company that had a very large population of frontline customer care representatives. And what they found was that these are very hard jobs. And as a result, they were losing people very quickly, not only during training, but just beyond training. And so they would spend, I believe, $2,000 to source people, to recruit them, to bring them into the company. And then ultimately, they'd lose the people within 30, 60, 90 days, and they'd have to rehire and start from scratch. Now, that had obvious implications for their customer satisfaction and brand recognition because people were talking to customer service reps that just didn't have much experience. But their opinion was that what was really driving all of this was their attrition, and they needed a way to keep people in those seats longer. And so what they did was they took stock of their data, and they did have volumes of performance data as well, but they really wanted to focus on their HR and attrition data. And so we ended up working with them to integrate that data with supplemental data covering a variety of other employee characteristics: their supervisors, their shift, their wages, the locations they worked in, the nature of the jobs themselves, the policies around overtime. Really, we left no stone unturned. And as a result, we were able to create a single integrated data set that combined all of these different data sources. And from there, we were able to take a step back and we did this discovery process. And what that involved is we asked them, what do you think you should be thinking about? What allows people to stay in these jobs longer? What are the key drivers of your attrition? And what we heard were 2 things. One was hiring criteria, and the other was education. And really, they were focused on the point of application and getting the best raw talent in, and they thought that was really what was going to drive positive attrition outcomes. And so by taking the data set that I mentioned before and applying some fairly simple econometric techniques, what we ended up with was a very different picture. The worker characteristics, that dark purple slice in the right-hand slide of the pie, they did account for a portion of their attrition. But it was dwarfed by almost everything else: company policies and characteristics, macroeconomic pressures, job characteristics, the nature of the job itself. And then the turquoise slide there, that represents their supervisors. And what we found was that their supervisors were driving more of the outcomes than everything else combined. And the effects were staggering. And we even double-checked these results with some of our research partners at Wharton and Yale, and they found the same effects, that supervisor was really the key driver and the key to this whole puzzle. So then we wanted to say, first off, what is improvement in attrition worth? And in this case, we did some very conservative calculations, and what we had determined was that a turn costed $2,000. I'm sorry, that's actually a typo in the very top. They targeted 20% improvement in employee tenure. So they determined what we're looking for is a 20% improvement in employee tenure. We think we can achieve that. So median tenure, increasing it from, I think, something like 120 days to 20% more than that. And ultimately, what they found was that a 20% improvement in employee median tenure would yield 1,000 avoided turns across the entire population at a cost of $2,000 per turn. That yields $2 million in cost savings due to reduced attrition. So of course, given all that, that's all nice and well and good, but how do we get there? So what we did is we dug into that piece of the pie representing the managers, and we generated survival curves. So these are the curves that we've actually generated for them. On the x-axis are days of service for the agents themselves. On the y-axis is the probability of survival. And we just displayed 10 supervisors here as a representative sample, but what you can see already is that there's huge variation, that there are some supervisors that are able to keep people very long periods of time, and there are some supervisors that see attrition from day one. And when, given that we're talking about such large populations of supervisors, in this case it was 600 supervisors, we decided to divide it into quartiles. So we decided 4 quartiles, tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we plotted survival according to those tiers. And we found a very interesting picture emerged, which is that tiers 1, 2, and 3 looked as they should, but they were relatively banded, they were relatively close together. But there's a 4th tier of supervisor that we're losing people at a remarkable rate. That light blue line at the bottom, those people were staying 50% shorter than anyone who was assigned to a supervisor in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd tier. I mean, it's really a staggering result. And so we then moved into this simulation exercise where we were able to use our black box, and we turned tier 4 supervisors into tier 3 supervisors. And we asked, what does that improvement yield? And ultimately, that yielded an ROI of approximately 1.9 million. It was about what we had targeted at the outset of this exercise. So the key is remembering that we weren't trying to turn every supervisor into Superman. We were just trying to make sure that we helped out the Michael Scotts of the world. And so to do that, that's an exercise that requires a little bit more digging. And so we worked with them to survey the supervisors and identify the characteristics of their top performers. And we found that there were actually a few things that really stood out. One was that their supervisors that were the best were actually very focused. They weren't multitaskers. They were able to stay on task and to provide specific feedback to their customer care representatives. Interestingly, they weren't innovators. They weren't more curious types. We found that the profile of the supervisor they wanted in this role was someone that would stick to company policy, that could follow rules, and could enforce those rules when necessary. And so given all that experience, what they did is they used this information to drive 2 actions. One is they deployed a coach assessment. So when someone left from the supervisor population, they replaced that person with someone who had been assessed with this coach assessment that identified the best attributes of their existing coach population. So they were very focused on hiring the right person and making sure that when someone left, they saw that as an opportunity to replace that person with someone even better. Second, they targeted the bottom tier supervisors for learning and development. And so they implemented train the trainer and train the coach type programs in order to ensure that everyone knew how best to coach their advisees and their employees. And ultimately, what that did was allow them to up-level that bottom tier and to bring everyone up to a certain level of proficiency when it came to managing and coaching. Now, of course, it isn't a process that wasn't fraught with some difficulties. And so in order to ensure that they were making progress against their goals, they created a continuous feedback loop. So they were analyzing these data on a weekly basis, and they were issuing report cards and ultimately monitoring attrition over time. That allowed them to identify which changes and which curricula had the biggest impact. They were able to make adjustments when the actual numbers didn't quite measure up with the simulated numbers. And ultimately what they found was that micro-level actions created macro-level results. So they were able to recalibrate and make quick adjustments in order to ensure that those actions at the employee level were driving that 1.9 million in ROI. This is actually a story that's in progress. We're continuing to see changes over time, but we found that we're really able to achieve according to kind of the roadmap that we had set out at the outset. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mike and open it up for any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. And before we take our audience questions, we want to give a couple of announcements here. First, we want to thank, again, Evolve for making today's program possible. You can learn more about Evolve at www.evolv.net. You can also follow Evolve on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+, and YouTube. We want to let you know the certification number for today's program. The HR Certification Institute has assigned this webcast the following number in its database. Okay, let's get on to audience questions here. Some questions first about getting started. An audience member asks, how long does it typically take to launch a big data project and see results?
That is a great question. So what we often advise is that it's best to start small and to build off of quick wins. So a truly big data initiative can take a while, but what we find is that just starting off by putting some different data streams together, analyzing it, generating results, and then using that in order to target improvement, we find that we're really just in the time frame of weeks to months to be able to generate some results and get some quick wins. So again, it can be daunting to think about big data and to be thinking about transforming the entire enterprise. And so what we often say is start small. And when we do that, we find clients are able to get results relatively quickly.
Very good. Another audience question here. Audience member asks, what skills or knowledge should an HR analytic practitioner focus on or develop to begin moving their company toward better using big data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another great question. So, in the case of folks that want to do it themselves, I would advise that at a minimum you find someone that's good with some very simple applications like Excel, right? So at least being able to read spreadsheets, understand how to combine them, things like that. Very, very sort of simple techniques. Over time, again, we can build off of those skills in order to be learning more about pulling data from bigger databases and using languages like SQL. But again, we think it's important to stay away from thinking about becoming a big data expert. We don't expect someone to take a Hadoop class tomorrow. Really, for someone that's an HR professional, the best approach is using very simple applications to combine different data streams and then doing very simple, t-tests, correlations, maybe a regression. All of those things, to the extent that people need some expertise, of course, there are outsiders that are available and consultants and so on and so forth that can provide advice as far as what models make the most sense.
Continuing with audience questions, let me group together here two that came in. One audience member asked, can you help me understand what type of data are we talking about here? Would retention and performance management ratings be the type of data you have in mind? A related question, what statistics do you find most useful and explainable to your clients? For example, regression, relative weighting, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So to the first question, attrition data is absolutely a starting point, and that's often where we start with all of our clients. And then we find that virtually everyone has some record of when someone started and when they left, and some very basic attributes about that individual, where they worked, what position they had, location, so on and so forth. That's a starting point. The question about workforce reviews, performance reviews is an interesting one, and there are different schools of thought. On the one hand, any performance data is good, and we don't like to discard anything. So to the extent that that data is available, that's a source of information. At the same time, we need to be cautious because performance reviews are somewhat subjective. And so we typically tend to focus on more objective measures to the extent that there are sales targets or measures of schedule adherence or productivity measures that can be fairly standardized. We tend to advise that those are the ones we want to focus on a little bit more because they're more objective. But really, all of those are good examples of data that could be used. Could you repeat the second question? I just want to make sure I got it correct.
Sure. The audience member asks, what statistics do you find are most useful and explainable to your clients? For example, regression, relative weighting, so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is difficult because at the end of the day, we want to make sure this is accessible to all different audiences. So to start, we find that people can generally understand the correlations and, essentially, t-tests and things that are relatively basic. From there, we do like to move the ball down the field and be thinking about regression. But again, you would never see me present regression output to any of our clients. At the end of the day, what they're not interested in is the raw regression output that I get from a program like Stata or R. What they're interested in is the insight. And so I would say that it's important to translate whatever the statistics say into actionable insight that lay people can really latch onto. And so that's really key, is making sure that I become, or whoever's doing these analytics, becomes somewhat of a filter and ensures that they're able to boil it down to what matters.
And kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, an audience member asks, if we don't have data, how do we go about generating it?
Another great question. The first thing I would say is I would question the assertion. I would argue most companies, the vast majority of companies have data, and it exists somewhere. And so a lot of times it's simply a matter of asking the right person or doing some digging and figuring it out. So as I mentioned, the attrition data, which is the starting point for all of the work we do, we find virtually everyone has attrition data, and sometimes they don't even know that where it exists. Now, if after examining that and digging in, they find they really don't have data, well, then you have to start from scratch. But we find that creating data sets, at least capturing start and hire and term dates, we find that employee surveys, those give a good view of culture and employee engagement. And so, a very simple Survey Monkey that again is free. You can survey your workforce, figure out at least what factors they think are driving attrition and performance. So it can absolutely be generated, but before we go down that path, before we start primary data collection, I always advise it's best to work from secondary data collection, because you'd be surprised at what organizations capture that they don't even know about.
And continuing this question of understanding the data, an audience member writes, when using big data, how do you go about ensuring that the data is accurate?
Again, great question. There's a process for kind of scrubbing the data. A lot of it is simply doing sanity checks. So as I mentioned, you'd be surprised that when we've integrated with a client and we start analyzing their data, the first thing we do is ask, what's the employee population? We ask them that, and then we ask the data that. And sometimes we end up with dramatically different answers. And so from there, the next question is, we assume they know how many people they employ. So we want to identify, why are there people either missing in the data feed or people that are in the data feed that we don't think should be there. And that yields some really interesting answers. We sometimes find that job positions and codes are misconfigured. So someone doesn't look like an employee when they should be, or vice versa. So basic sanity checks are really key towards ensuring that the data has consistency and accuracy and integrity. And just scrutinizing each of the fields that you're going to use in the analysis and ensuring that that field conforms with your expectations. And then, of course, also very basic things like, is it a numeric or a string field? If it's a string field, are they consistent, right? Term reason codes. There can be a million different reasons do we want to bucket those into just a few, like voluntary versus involuntary? So it's just a matter of cleaning up the data, going through and making sure it's consistent, categorizing it, and doing some very basic sanity checks.
For our audience members, before you close out today, we hope you'll take a moment to give us your thought about today's program. Under the main slide, you should see a tab there labeled Survey. If you could fill out the evaluation form and let us know what you think, it helps us assess today's program and plan for future events. We're going to push that in front of you in just a moment. If you want to return to the slide view, just click the tab in that same area that says Slides. Continuing with audience questions, audience member asks, kind of in a similar vein, what's your advice if you capture data, but you find it's not the right kind of data?
I normally want to talk to that person and find out exactly what they mean by it not being the right kind of data. From our experience, virtually anything can be, as long as it can be linked with workforce outcomes like attrition and performance, virtually anything can be linked up. We actually had a client that had a wiki, so they were keeping track of information online in a kind of intranet, and they were capturing data on who was engaging with that wiki, who was going online, reading pages. It doesn't seem initially like something that would be workforce related. It was their IT department that was capturing this data. But there is no question that people who are engaging with the wiki more often are more engaged employees and ultimately are going to stay longer and perform better. So data streams can come from very surprising places. And so I first question the assertion that this isn't the right kind of data, because I found that often you find answers in the places you least expect. We've mined data on people's commutes and their travel time to work, and even walkability of work sites. And we found interesting relationships there, whereas it's not a data feed that we would have initially dug into. And we're currently digging into things like weather patterns. So, the first question is, what data do we not think is relevant, and why don't we think it's relevant? If we really don't think it's applicable, we don't have that enterprise workforce data, then the answer is the same as the question I answered a couple questions ago, which is we need to start building data. So capturing hire and term dates at a minimum, maybe administering some sort of engagement, post-hire surveys, starting to get information about the employees, and then collating it and merging it and combining the data streams.
Question here about the 5 steps you talked about on slide 28, and I'm going to go ahead and push over to that. Mm-hmm. Audience member says, what does an organization need to have in place to leverage big data as discussed in the 5 steps? It seems to me there are some practices, resource, and culture that needs to be in place first so the environment lends itself to this.
Yeah, there is no question that that's the case. And we touched on it a little bit in that fourth piece, which is deploy and act. But these can't exist in a vacuum. These big data initiatives, it can't be an analyst being locked in a room, working on a spreadsheet and generating some interesting findings. You need to make sure that you're getting buy-in from all levels of the organization. So one thing that you need in place, of course, is the infrastructure. So you need A, the data, B, the tools to analyze that data, C, you need people to be able to use those tools and extract insight. All of those are foundational. But I think what the question touches on is that is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. And what you also need is organizational buy-in. So it's important to make sure everyone knows what's going on, what sort of analyses are being engaged in and done. They need to trust the results. They need to believe that the insights are truly the results that they can expect to achieve if they follow this course of action. And then ultimately, we need frontline managers and hiring managers and various individuals in the organization to act. And so we need to convince them that this is the right course of action, and that requires that buy-in that I mentioned. So, I think it was the Forrester slide that made that point, that this isn't about slapping a big data label on something. This is really about foundational, cultural, and organizational and executive change.
Very good. A couple questions about the case study. Audience member asked, what was the timeline on the example? I realize it's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. So I believe for just the upfront data work, the analysis, combining the data, doing the analysis, simulating the results, it was in I think it was the 2 to 3 month range to be able to generate that insight. And then ultimately, it was a year where we targeted that 20% improvement and that $2 million ROI. So again, we're still in progress of executing on those action plans, recalibrating. But what's really neat is that with just a 2 or 3 month investment on the part of our team and theirs, we were able to generate some really interesting insight that was actionable, that galvanized their executives all the way on down into making changes. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say this doesn't need to be a all-encompassing, enterprise-changing solution, that we start small. And we just started with literally 150 supervisors. You could fill them in a pretty decent-sized room. It wasn't hundreds or tens of thousands of people that we were trying to change their behavior.
Another audience member asks, in the Fortune 100 example, did you take into account involuntary versus voluntary attrition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another good point. We did some analysis of that as well. We found that the trends kind of were borne out regardless of if termination were voluntary or involuntary. So there's no questions that some of the bad bosses were getting people to leave more quickly, but that those people also tended to be letting folks go more regularly. So it was that the results kind of borne themselves were similar regardless of if we focused on voluntary or involuntary. But that's a good point, and it's a really interesting distinction. Because you need to make sure that you distinguish people from people leaving because they have other opportunities, from people leaving because they were let go because they were struggling on the role.
Another audience member asks, who did the coaching assessment? Was it the employees or was it management?
Yeah, so it was, we worked with them. The assessment itself was something that our IO psychologist developed. Based on attributes we had seen at other clients that were predictive of good coaches. But credit to the client, because engaging in a survey of 600 supervisors is not an easy feat. And we made sure, we wanted to make clear that this came from them and that this wasn't us pushing this on them. So while we created the assessment and we had the online tool that they could use to administer it, it was absolutely their organization, their executives that bought into this, and they administered the assessment, achieving response rates in excess of 80%, which quite frankly is virtually unparalleled from my experience in terms of existing employee assessments. And ultimately, it was that huge sample size that allows us to generate robust findings that we can then use to fine-tune the profile for their supervisors.
And the final audience question, audience member asks, can you explain how big data could be useful for organizations with little turnover, but having difficulty finding candidates?
That's a great point. I would say, so turnover is one metric, and we tend to be focused on that because it's a very obvious metric of measure of engagement. But bear in mind, performance is another whole bucket of KPIs that you want to be looking at. Things like customer satisfaction and productivity, sales conversion. So those are often metrics that our clients turn to when attrition is less of a concern. With that said, when we're talking about sourcing specifically, that is one input into these equations. So what you want to identify is what's the outcome of interest, be it attrition or performance or any number of measures. And now one of the inputs is a source, right? It's the applicant, potentially their responses to interview questions, but it's also where they came from. And so when we feed that into the model, what their source was, whether they were referred, whether they came from an online posting like Career Builder, whether they came through LinkedIn, that's one way of identifying the best candidates. And actually, I'll just take an opportunity to shamelessly plug some of our research with researchers at Berkeley and University of Toronto. We did an analysis of referrals. So we identified people who were referred by friends versus people who weren't. And what we found is that referred employees were 20%, they stayed 20% longer than non-referred employees. And they were slightly better on performance metrics as well. So armed with that information and knowing that the average referral bonus in this industry was, I think, $50 to $75, we went back to clients and said, you should probably up your referral bonus because you're getting your best candidates from referrals because their friends set expectations and then coach them on the job.
Very good. And with that question and answer, we are going to bring to a close today's webcast.